The battle for the city of Bakhmut has become the most crucial part of the Ukraine war. Both Ukraine and Russia have focused their efforts on this small city. In recent months, despite all its impossibilities, Russia is attacking with all its might to make a tangible gain in the war that has been going on for more than a year. But it can't get past the steel curtain of Ukraine's defense. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, perfectly demonstrates its defensive capabilities while at the same time inflicting heavy damage on the Russian army with offensive operations. The other day, the large ammunition depot of the Russian army near Bakhmut was destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The huge arsenal of the Russians was used jointly by the Chechen troops of Wagner and Kadyrov. Considering the current shortage of ammunition, as well as the serious logistical problems in this aspect of the front line, the loss of large numbers of shells will put the Russian army in serious trouble in the later days of the war. According to preliminary data, it was reported that a few days ago in the explosion of an ammunition depot in the south of Bakhmut, Russian soldiers were also killed in addition to the ammunition of the Russian army. But there is still no official information about how many soldiers died. It was probably the troops of Wagner and Kadyrov that were destroyed here. It is known that this direction is actively used by the armed forces of Ukraine, which is trying to unblock their territory to withdraw some of the units from the city. But the Wagner PMC fighters are also located here in defensive positions. To this day, battles for Bakhmut continue actively. At the same time, it is known that Russian troops control about 30% of the territory of the city. And at the moment, the armed forces of Ukraine are advancing from the eastern direction also. Efforts by the Wagner PMC to fight on the front lines and try to break through the Ukrainian defense lines are also fruitless. After 14 Leopard tanks from Poland were sent to the region, Russian troops and Wagner PMC began to lose their effectiveness in the region. Wagner is constantly making publications and statements that he is advancing in Bakhmut and pushing back the Ukrainian army. But contrary to what is believed, the opposite is true. The Ukrainian army does not hesitate to use its advanced weapons against the Wagner troops, who, together with the Russian troops, suffered huge losses in Bakhmut. Ukraine's Western partners rolled up their sleeves in order to increase Ukraine's war effort and not lose its frontline superiority. Tanks committed by the USA and UK gradually began to enter the Ukrainian army inventory. On the other hand, there is participation from many Western countries in the tank coalition led by Poland, and the number of tanks to be given to Ukraine from the coalition officials is astonishing. All of these efforts, of course, are taking place in order for Ukraine to win the war and to prevent the harmful policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Particularly NATO member Eastern European countries know that if Russia wins the Ukraine war, it will be their turn, and they support Ukraine in its just struggle with all their might. We can easily see on the front line that Ukraine has not left these supports unanswered. After the Ukrainian army received the bombs of the JDAM family from the USA, these weapons began to be used to attack the territory of Bakhmut and its surroundings. These aerial bombs are used, among other things, to attack Wagner troops and Russian army elements stationed in Bakhmut. Since such aerial bombs can be launched from distances of up to 72 kilometers and the damage they inflict is huge, we can say that it is the end game for Wagner PMC. The Ukrainian army has not yet made a statement about the use of such weapons, but the US has previously confirmed that these weapons are being used by the Ukrainian army. The ammunition is most likely used by MiG-29 and Su-27 aircraft in service with the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, the fact that the Ukrainian army has reached the stage of ending the Wagner presence in Bakhmut shows us that victory is near for Bakhmut. So do the initiatives of the Ukrainian army prevent the attacks of the Russian army? The answer to that is, unfortunately, no. Despite significant losses, the Russian army continues offensive operations in Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shakhtarsk directions. In the past day, units of the Ukraine Defense Forces repelled more than 100 Russian attacks in the indicated directions. During the day, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 10 attacks on the areas where the Russian troops were concentrated. Ukrainian missile and artillery units struck 5 areas where Russian troops were deployed. Russian personnel and military equipment, as well as 3 ammunition depots, and for electronic warfare systems were destroyed by the Ukrainian Army. The Ukrainian General Staff emphasizes that the Russian Federation is using terrorist tactics, bombing settlements indiscriminately, and this is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. In the past day, the Russian army carried out 5 missile attacks, mainly on civilian infrastructure objects in the Sumy and Donetsk regions. There were reported deaths and injuries among civilians. The Russian army also carried out 35 airstrikes and 76 attacks using multiple launch rocket systems. But the majority of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainian defense troops. Still, the threat of new missile strikes on Ukrainian soil remains high, and the Ukrainian Defense Forces are focused on future attacks with the losses of the Russian army in recent days. The loss of soldiers of the Russian army since February 2022, when the war started, is around 160,000, according to the Ukrainian military. Russia allegedly launched more than 100 unsuccessful attacks on Ukraine in one day. The alleged attacks are the latest indication that he is trying to advance the special military operation launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin's forces continued to stagnate in Ukraine after more than a year of conflict, with conflicts largely concentrated in Ukraine's easternmost regions, including the Donbass. Russia continued to lay claim to areas where it failed to succeed, including the eastern city of Bakhmut, where some of the conflict's most intense fighting took place. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported earlier in the week that its forces had repulsed several attacks from 5 key cities, including Bakhmut, amid speculation earlier in the week that Russia could approach the city. The Russian military is not giving up its efforts to continue the war in Ukraine. Despite the significant losses, the Russian army continues its offensive activities in the directions of Limansky, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariinsky, and Shakhtar. The last day units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces repelled 102 Russian attacks. On these lines, the Russian army also carried out other attacks, including 3 missile attacks on the city of Sloviansk. Amid the setbacks, Russia turned to attacks on Ukraine's civil and energy infrastructure during the winter months to put more pressure on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to get to the negotiating table. Russia also conducted 8 airstrikes and carried out 49 bombardments from bottom-firing jet systems. The Ukrainian military has accused Russia of using terrorist tactics against Ukraine, the latest in allegations that Russia violated human rights throughout the war. It was alleged that the Russian Federation grossly violated international humanitarian law standards and continued to use terrorist tactics by indiscriminately bombing Ukrainian settlements. Ukraine claimed that it repelled these attacks, as Moscow seeks a rare victory after months of stagnation. Both Russia and Ukraine continued to fight for control of Bakhmut, which experts say bears more symbolic significance for Russia. Ukraine has 2 current targets for Bakhmut: to reduce as much as possible the combat-ready personnel of the Russian army and to squeeze them into several grueling key battles, interrupting their offensive and concentrating elsewhere the resources of the Ukrainian army for the spring counteroffensive. Our esteemed followers know now, like the whole world, that by another place here you mean Crimea. The Ukrainian army and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, say at every opportunity that Crimea should be liberated from Russian control and emphasized that steps have been taken in this regard. The war in Ukraine reshaped the military, political, and economic balances all over the world in this war. The countries of the world determined their ranks in a short time. Ukraine's allies in Eastern Europe have also begun to step up security measures against the aggressive policies of the Russians. From the moment Russia signaled that it would invade Ukraine, the world focused on one question. We can say that the answer to this question is a candidate to determine the long-term fate not only of the wall, but of Europe and the rest of the world. As Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine has almost completed its first year, things are not going as the Kremlin had long hoped. While almost everyone in the world predicted that the Russian army would enter Kiev in a few days, Ukraine's formidable resistance and massive support and sanctions in which much of the world participated thwarted Moscow's plans. Contrary to Putin's expectations, the West gave an unprecedented response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How could Putin be so wrong? Putin's exaggeration of Russia's military might and his underestimation of Ukraine's resistance are part of the answer. But most importantly, he misread the West. Russian President Vladimir Putin believed in the idea that the West would abandon Ukraine to its fate based on his experience of the weak reaction of the international community. Given Europe's concern about Washington's commitment to European security, both in the wake of the Trump presidency and the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Moscow administration has argued that the Russian invasion will divide the United States and its European allies and set up a puppet government in Kiev. It was planned that he could achieve a strategic victory had Putin studied better how Western democracies are responding to solemn threats to their own security. He would have realized how wrong these assumptions were. Russia did not anticipate that it would react swiftly, decisively, and vigorously when the Western democracies were pressed on the tail. The Ukraine war is a conflict that has not only regional but also global effects, as it has the potential to trigger geopolitical fault lines in the world. It has already begun to shape alliances around the world. Countries whose economies have been crushed by the rising inflation expect peace as soon as possible and energy and food prices to return to normal levels. A group of NATO member countries led by the USA, Britain and Poland, and countries that have historical accounts with Russia, such as Japan, seek to wear Moscow militarily and economically to the last possible point. With Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has tried to portray himself in a god complex by comparing himself to the famous imperialist Peter the Great. Putin tried to convince the non-Western world that he would bring back multipolarity. Although Vladimir Putin used false excuses to invade Ukraine, he directed most of the Russian autocratic core rhetoric mostly to Western governments. The Russian president sought to form a coalition of countries willing to fight the West to bring the multipolar world upside down with the aim of overthrowing the long-standing American hegemony. These ambitions were too small, to say the least, as the people he thought were allies did not support his war in the way he thought. In the early stages of the war, Putin tried to persuade JDAM member states such as Kazakhstan and Belarus to formally send troops and participate in the invasion. While the Russian media portrayed this war as Moscow's coalition against NATO, it was also a call to action for its allies to intervene. Accordingly, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko became aware of Russian military operations during his occupation. Tens of thousands of Russian troops flowed into Ukraine from Belarus borders, allowing the Kremlin to use this country as a launching pad. Despite the logistical support, Lukashenko formally hesitates to intervene. Putin tried many times to persuade Belarus to join, but without success. On the other hand, another pillar of Putin's collapsed. North Korea has supported the fake proxies of the Donbass, but it also firmly states that it will not help the Russian invasion, feeling the need to take precautions in the face of the situation, which is seen as a part of hostile attempts to damage North Korea's image in the international arena. North Korea once again reiterated that they have never exchanged arms with Russia and that it has no such plans to do that in the future. Also, since the country remains isolated from the international community with one of the worst economies in the world, we can say that their support means nothing in conflict. In short, the Russian leader did not get the support he expected from his allies. The splendor of Putin's personal ego and the support he envisioned turned out to be the opposite of what he had expected. The Russian leader was also largely alone on the diplomatic front. The international community turned to Russia in order to prove Russia's injustice many times before the world public opinion to adopt the sanctions placed on Russia by Western countries, by other countries to increase the price Russia paid for the occupation and to prevent another country from violating international law in a similar way. In conclusion, setting a precedent for the occupation of Ukraine by Russia carries serious risks for the theme of the international system in peace. This situation causes many states, especially Russia's allies, to worry about providing a peaceful environment. It seems that even if Russia achieves its military goals as a result of the Ukraine war, it will have to continue on its way as an excluded and weakened actor in the world economy and politics. Instead of dividing the West, Putin's attack on Ukraine has united the West. The United States and its allies joined forces to impose a comprehensive sanctions regime on Russia, making Russia the most sanctioned country in the world. Western countries also mobilized politically against Russia, and the West's military response was equally impressive. Instead of withdrawing forces from Eastern Europe, as Putin had requested, NATO has doubled its military presence in the region by mobilizing the Emergency Response Force. More than 35 countries have increased their arms shipments to Ukraine. Historically, even the most reluctant countries to engage in international conflicts have joined the sanctions. Switzerland and Singapore imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Known for its strict immigration policy, Japan has opened its doors to Ukrainians fleeing their country. Most importantly, German Chancellor Scholz announced that his country would provide military assistance to Ukraine, increase defense spending in line with NATO commitments, set up a €100 billion defense fund to modernize its obsolete army, and promise to quickly end its dependence on Russia in energy. The West has tried to respond together against the possible invasion of Russia. Top U.S. intelligence officials briefed their allies about Putin's plans and shared sensitive information that even senior U.S. officials would not normally see. Western diplomats met with their colleagues to plan possible sanctions packages. US commanders met with NATO and other allies to discuss how to improve preparedness and how to design possible security assistance for Ukraine. This painstaking diplomacy also disproved Vladimir Putin's belief that making demands on the allies could backfire. Looking at the point reached, Putin will undoubtedly try to exploit the divisions within the alliance. Disagreements may arise about what steps to take or what concessions to offer. The burden of punishing Russia will inevitably fall unevenly between countries, which can fuel conflicts. Solving these challenges will require skillful diplomacy, as leaders in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and other capitals tackle such problems. They seek to formalize the cooperation sparked by Putin's brutality, forming the core of a new alliance of democracies that many have long demanded. Accordingly, in the coming years, there will be more geopolitical threats, such as Russia's possible pursuit of revenge, and the major democracies will have to counter them with institutionalized cooperation. Western countries should enhance their mutual defenses and deepen their economic relations, including the United States and the EU. In the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and negotiating a transatlantic trade and investment agreement as a first step, they should expand the G7 to include Australia, South Korea, and the European Union. This will bring together the leading advanced democracies of North America, Europe, and Asia under one roof and provide a powerful counterweight to the oppression that is plaguing all democratic countries. The West must now roll up its sleeves for a longer struggle. Ukrainian forces continue successfully advancing in all main directions. Yesterday I told you that Wagner may very soon become the main axis of advance. And today, Russian sources confirmed that after demining the field and conducting small reconnaissance in first operations, Ukrainians launched a much bigger attack. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians are advancing not only eastward, but also southward, and that today Ukrainian assault units establish control over multiple Russian positions in the tree lines. Ukrainian forces are also ramping up the intensity of their attacks in the direction of Rivne. Appeal to the Russian sources reported that Ukrainians assaulted the settlement with up to 5 tanks and 5 armored fighting vehicles. The goal of this combination of attacks remains to even out the front line and set the conditions for a broader line of advancement. Ukrainian fighters continue releasing footage showing their newly captured positions and the process of sorting the captured equipment, cleaning the trenches, and preparing the trenches for defending against potential Russian counterattacks. The Ukrainian assault units demonstrated their trophies captured in the aftermath of heavy fights. They said that judging by the quality of the equipment they were fighting against, extremely well-prepared Russian forces, not some under-equipped, mobilized soldiers that did not know how to effectively use complex weapons, which makes the victory even more meaningful. Ukrainians also confirmed that they captured multiple pieces of heavy equipment, such as tanks and armored fighting vehicles. When it comes to the Russian counterattack, as expected, Russian forces failed to recapture Makarovka due to the weak control over the tactical heights around the settlement. Russian sources reported that they relocated their forces from the Orikhiv front to increase the scale and potency of their counterattack and opened another direction, namely Orogeny. Some sources claim that the village is now in the gray zone, and the ongoing clashes do not cease because Ukrainians stubbornly continue to hold the line in order to undermine Russian offensive capabilities. Ukrainian forces have deployed several HIMARS crews to the region to conduct precise counter-battery fire. Geolocated footage showed how Ukrainians destroyed 5 Russian artillery systems, 2 near one tree line and 3 near another tree line. All self-propelled artillery systems were located near Yelninsky, which is approximately 17 kilometers behind the front line. In a desperate attempt to change the situation, Russian forces hacked the radio in the region and started broadcasting a message. They claimed that Ukrainian positions were cut from 2 sides and there was no escape, and the Ukrainian command did not plan to save them, which is why other forces have already left their positions. They said that this was their last chance to capitulate because all Ukrainian reserves had been destroyed. Ironically, in the meantime, Ukrainians conducted a massive hammer strike on Russian reserves and eliminated more than 200 Russian soldiers. This caused a massive scandal and an official investigation in the Russian media space, and Russian sources quickly found out and published the cause and results of the Ukrainian strike. If you still remember, around 3 months ago, I made a video about the biggest tank battle in Ukraine that took place in front of Woldor. I told you that in the aftermath of disastrous planning, Russian forces lost almost 150 tanks and armored fighting vehicles and several brigades worth of troops. There are 2 people responsible for this disaster: Lieutenant General Rustam Muradov and Colonel Sarah Mammadov. Interestingly, in their reports, they claimed that they achieved unbelievable success, which is why Putin sent an executive order to give both of them a high rank, and Rustam Muradov became a colonel general while Zurab Akhmadov became a major general. As you might have already guessed, the success of the Ukrainian hammer strike was only possible because these commanders were left in charge. Russian sources reported that Zurab Akhmadov wanted to give a motivational speech to his troops and called everyone to assemble in the yard and wait for him. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian reconnaissance drone operators quickly noticed the parade, gave the coordinates to the HIMARS crews, and eliminated at least 200 Russian troops. So Akhmadov effectively killed his own troops by ordering everyone to gather in the plain sight of the enemy and forcing everyone to wait for an extended period of time. Even the most prominent Russian sources are calling for the execution of the General Akhmadov by firing squad. and they claim that such Russian commanders killed more Russians with their criminal orders than Ukrainians did with weapons.